Thank you, everybody, for turning up for this first adventure of this Friday evening seminar series. I hope we have an enjoyable time together. I really welcome questions, so please use the little chat panel in the corner of your screen. We also have a future audience. I'm recording this event today so that people can enjoy it later on when they need to, and everybody who's here now will also be able to access the recording later. There's going to be a couple of breaks during this presentation, and I really encourage you to use them when we get there, because getting this kind of information into your system is actually a lot more physical than you might think. There is, of course, the kind of intellectual cognitive aspect to this, where we have to listen and try to digest it and make sense of it, but it's also a lot to sit and take it into our bodies and our more subtle energy body, perhaps. So without further ado, let's begin this first seminar on neuroscience and spirituality. Now, to set the scene for you a little bit, I'd like to tell you why I came up with this seminar. And it's because I have a bit of a dual background, both in quite spiritual matters and in much more scientific matters. And it's sometimes been quite hard to straddle those two worlds, if you will. So having one foot in the mystery of life and the other foot in the facts and the measurable science of life. So I'm currently doing my PhD in neuropsychology, and I'm also an interfaith minister. So I cater to the spiritual events and needs in people's lives. And I've also been a complementary therapist and energy healer for many years. So I am, in fact, right in the middle of that, what has been for a long time, divide between those two worlds. So for my own sanity and well-being, I decided to put this presentation together in order to give a sense of where we are in bringing those two worlds closer together. And these days, I have to say, I've come to the conclusion that perhaps they're not two separate worlds at all, but there is in fact ways that both of those worlds can talk together and perhaps meet somewhere out there in the fog that was separating them. So the bridge we're going to walk today is from cell to soul, or from soul to cell. And let's get started with a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. The first section of the presentation today is about how the brain is laid out and what the functional areas are inside the brain. There is both grey and white matter inside the brain. There are hemispheres in the brain, and there are brain waves, and there are different lobes inside the brain. So all of that is going to form the first part of our presentation, the nuts and bolts, if you like, of how the brain is. We need to start there because otherwise we're going to find ourselves talking about stuff without a grounding in stuff. So once you've kind of earned your little badge of achievement in knowing what's what in the brain and how it's put together, we're going to talk about the methods of neuroscience. So there are three particular methods that I'm going to talk to you about today that use different approaches to measuring stuff in the brain. That's going to be fMRI, TMS, and EEG. There's a lot of material to cover, but hopefully there's going to be a variation in the tempo we go at. Some of it is going to be me talking to you. Sometimes I'm going to ask you questions, and sometimes there'll be little experiential things that we'll do together to see how you get on with that. So let's get started. So first of all, what's the brain made of? Well, it might be important to say that your brain is inside your head. There are also other brains, of course, in the body. You could also talk about the brain of the heart and the brain of the digestive system. We're not going to be talking about those today. We're focusing on the brain of the nervous system that is contained inside the skull. So what I'm showing you here on the screen now is an old-fashioned neuroanatomy drawing. They used to be done like this, where you would see how things are located inside the body. These days, you're more likely to see a 3D rendering of a brain inside the body, and you can sort of turn it round and see how it all looks. But I think there's something quite charming about these old illustrations. What you also very often see when you study the brain these days is something that looks like this, a diagram. And when I went to medical school some years ago, we would see a lot of diagrams like this, and they were always color-coded. Of course, color coding makes it easier to tell the parts of the brain from one another on a diagram. But as I found out to my great dismay when I did my first dissection of a dead person in the laboratory, there is no color coding in the brain. So a lot of the brain can look really similar. On this diagram here that I'm showing you, you can see that there are distinct parts because of the distinct colors, but there are still some landmarks that can give us a sense of where things are. So let me try now and show you. Hopefully you can see a pointer on the screen now. There is a line that goes down the center of the brain, which is the central sulcus, and that kind of divides the front part of the brain from the rear part of the brain. And there's also this area you can see in yellow, that's also separated by a sulcus, which is called a fissure, that goes along the edge and down under here. And that's the temporal lobe. So that's a part of the brain that sits more on the side of the head. So for those of you who haven't figured it out yet, this brain we're seeing here is from a person who's facing towards the left-hand side of the screen. So their nose would be somewhere over here where it says temporal lobe. And then there's another part of the brain called the cerebellum, which you can see with these lines on it. And that's actually a part of the brain that looks different to the naked eye, whereas the rest of the brain looks very similar from the outside. So now we've got our bearings, and I apologize to those of you who already know all this, but we have to start from the same beginning so we can all walk in the same direction. So what is the brain made of? Well, there are two distinct types of matter inside the brain. You might have heard of these before. They're called similar names in most languages I can think of. They use colors to describe them, so gray matter and white matter. And if you look at the central picture here with the blue background, you can see what looks like white stuff more inside the brain and gray stuff, gray matter, on the outside of the brain. Now, there is a specific distinction between those. The gray stuff tends to be where the bodies of cells are, and inside the white matter are connections between the cells that might be out here on the outside of the brain, or that might be in these deeper structures inside of the brain. So it's a little bit like the gray matter is where the little villages and people are, and this white stuff are the big pathways and motorways between those places. Now, there is a misnomer in calling gray matter because that's only how it looks in a dead person. And of course, when brains were first examined, a lot of those studies were done on dead people, thankfully. So when the brain dies, that matter on the outside gets a distinct hue of grey, as does a lot of the body, incidentally. But if you look at this picture here on the right, you can see that actually this, what would be grey matter, is more pink. And it's got little capillaries, blood vessels running on it, large veins running on it. So on a living person, were you ever to look at the brain of somebody who's still alive, it would look more like pink matter. The white matter inside is still white though, regardless of whether they're living or dead. So that one they got correct back in the day where they started naming all the anatomical structures of the body. And what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is an image I particularly like. It's done with something called DTI, which is diffusion tensor imaging. And that's showing you some of those motorways I spoke about, the white matter connections in the brain. So that is essentially a section, a side view, of how some of the connections from the outer areas of the brain and the inner areas of the brain are connected. So here, what I referred to earlier as paths and motorways are shown in these different colors. That's a really good way of doing imaging of the brain if you suspect that there might be a problem in the white matter of somebody's brain. So that's a rough layout of what the brain is made of, this white matter and grey matter. So now let's look at what a neuron is. So you might have heard of this word neuron before. It's a type of cell, but there are many different types of cells in the body. And a neuron is a constituent part of the nervous system, which is what collects information from the body and sends it to the brain and helps the brain to process it, and gets information from the brain and sends it down into the body as signals for us, for example, to move our hand. So a typical neuron has, I'd say, three important parts to it. The first part is the cell body. Now, you remember a moment ago we were talking about grey matter and white matter. So the cell bodies of neurons sit predominantly in the grey matter, so on the outside of the brain or deep inside the structures. And the cell body essentially receives information. How does it do that? Through these little branches that are out here called dendrites. And they are in contact with other neurons. So on the picture on the left, you can see where all these little red sparks are happening. That's where there is contact between a dendrite on a neuron that is receiving information and taking it to the cell body. And then it sends that information further on down what's called the axon. So if I trace one here, that then goes to another connection with another neuron. So on the picture of the right, once again, the information comes from other neurons into the dendrites, into this cell body, which has a nucleus. And if there is enough incoming information, then the signal is sent down this axon, down into these axon terminals down here that have these little buds on them, which are in contact with the next load of dendrites. And there's a lot of research still going on around how does a neuron decide if a signal that is coming in is important enough. For example, as you're sitting and listening to me talking here and looking at this information on the screen, there might be something else going on in the room around you. There might, for example, be a little sound or something that moves out of the corner of your eye. So in your brain, there is information coming in from your senses, through your eyes, through your ears, and that's being filtered all the time. So that's a kind of subconscious process that's going on. And then if the signal is strong enough, or if you have been what's called primed to look out for a certain type of signal, then the neuron that has collected that information will decide that's enough of information for me to send it down to the next one and start a chain reaction. It's actually incredible how much information that there is around us all the time. If you just think about when you're walking down the road or driving, and there is so much visual imagery coming at you that you kind of have to filter it. Otherwise, it would be completely overwhelming. So it is a wonderful thing in a way that information is filtered and not every single signal that we receive is passed on from the dendrites down the axon to the next one and so forth. Although, of course, sometimes it's also a bit of a shame when we miss out on potential information that might be quite subtle that's coming into our awareness. We'll talk a little bit more about that later when we start addressing the more spiritual experiences. So that, more or less, is a neuron. To give you a sense of size, these can range from 1/10 of a millimeter, tiny, tiny little neurons in the brain that connect one neuron with another, called interneurons, very small, to around 1 meter or more in length. So now you'll be thinking, what do you mean a meter or more in length? Surely, if the brain is inside the head, as you said, why would there be a meter-long neuron? That doesn't make sense. Well, it's because there are also motor neurons, as I said, that send information down the body. So now I'm moving my hand because there's a particular part of my brain that has created a signal that's sending that information down a neuron that has a really long axon. And if you think about a blue whale, there can be neurons in a blue whale that are 25 meters long. So if you then consider 25 meters long, of course, is a lot, and most of us are less than 2 meters, how does my thought arrive at my hand so quickly? My hands are moving at the same speed that I'm thinking to move them. So this is an interesting thing about the way that information is communicated along neurons. It has something called saltatory conduction, and that's down the axon. So on this picture here, you can see there are little blue bits. In real life, that's actually white, and guess what? That's the white matter. So that white matter is essentially myelin, which is a fatty kind of tissue, and it covers the axon partways, as you can see in the picture, and there are little gaps in between. So instead of the signal having to travel bit by bit down this very long axon here, down to the axon terminals, and then repeat the process again with the next neuron, it jumps. So it starts from the axon hillock, comes a little bit down, and then does this saltatory jumping conduction down to the ends so it can go into the axon terminals and send the message. And in that way, we are able to carry out our thoughts and our intention so quickly. This is something that's not that old in terms of evolutionary history of animals. There are animals that don't have this saltatory conduction, and squid, there are some of them. So when they're moving their long arms, they don't have this saltatory conduction. So they can't reconfigure themselves quite as quickly as we can because our signals jump so much faster down this myelin sheath. So to take away from this slide here, remember that the cell body is predominantly what the gray matter along the outside of the brain and in the deep structures is composed of, and the white matter is a whole load of these axons coated in this fatty white myelin sheath that sends information really quickly from one area of the brain to the other. Okay, so that's already a pretty solid grounding you have there in the basic neuroanatomy of what the brain is made of. And just out of interest, you might want to know that there is about 86 billion neurons in the brain. Okay, so moving on, you might have heard in popular culture about this thing of people being left-brained or right-brained. And I'm sure there are people here who say, oh, you know, I'm a bit more of a left-brain person, or I guess most of you, because you've turned up here, you probably have a little bit of both, but you might consider yourselves, well, some of you, a little bit more right-brained. And there is this myth in popular culture that the left brain is about logic and analysis and working out details of things and stuff. And the right brain is this kind of open, creative, slightly wild, artistic territory where we're in contact with everything and oneness. So unsurprisingly, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, although it is a very easy way to describe these things that's really caught the popular imagination, I guess. So what is more true is something like this. And I'm sorry this doesn't look nearly as interesting as the previous picture, but these two hemispheres that the brain has, so two halves of a circle, therefore hemisphere, they do have a precise task distribution that has been identified, not fully, but there are things that are known about what the left brain part of the brain does well and what the right part of the brain, the right hemisphere, does well. And this is research that's still ongoing. But I'll share with you just a few things about what is currently known to differentiate these two hemispheres. Now, just to give you a little bit of context for why evolutionarily we have two hemispheres, the current theory is that they're specialized. So if we had one whole brain where all the parts had functions that were only in that place and only did that thing, we would probably be in trouble. But at the same time, if the whole brain didn't have specialized areas, we wouldn't be able to get very good at something in particular. So there's a theory that says evolution has done a little bit of a balancing act to make sure that the brain has some what's called redundancy. That means that if a function should fail somewhere, that there's a way to perhaps regain some of that or for another structure to take over. But at the same time, just as if you have a team working on something, you do need people to pick up the slack for others, but you also need people who are quite specialized in certain areas. Otherwise, everybody who had the same background wouldn't be able to achieve the same. I mean, I guess this kind of makes sense, right? So the idea is that the brain has also somewhat specialized in the two hemispheres, but it's in quite particular ways. So what is known is that the left hemisphere is really good at the small picture. So for example, as I look at my screen right now, I can see that there's a blob of green and there's a blob of orange, and there's some words on there that have particular shapes. So that's the left hemisphere that's processing this information. It's giving me the detail. I can pick out where things are on the screen, and I can see the shape of the letters, and I can read them as words. What my right hemisphere is doing is it's seeing the big picture. It's looking at this slide on the screen and it's going, oh, a diagram. And then it's going, wow, it's a kind of presentation with pictures and words. And it sees the whole thing. And it also sees my whole computer screen and what's around my computer screen. And it's got a little bit of an eye on what's happening out of the corner of my eye further around me in the room. So why is that necessary? Well, if you think about when we were hunters and gatherers, 10,000 years ago, and much more recently for some people, and even now there are still cultures living like that, we need to be able to focus on a detail. For example, what is the berry that I need to pick, or what is the mushroom that I need to pick in order to not kill myself through mushroom poisoning, while at the same time, another part of me is looking at the big picture. For example, is there a huge bear coming towards me? Or is there an enemy coming that might try to steal my berries and my mushrooms and whatnot, right? Or is there a really attractive person that I need as a mate, So we have this duality of function going on at the same time. So the two hemispheres are working like this together for us. And if we then go into even more detail about what's known about the left and right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, this is very interesting, predominantly processes positive emotions. So if you show people pictures of positive scenes, you see that that process is going on predominantly on the left-hand side. Whereas if we have to process a negative emotion, for example, a sad face or hearing about some tragedy that's happened on the news, those emotions tend to be processed on the right. So now that might be blowing up these ideas of the right side of the brain being this beautifully wonderful, creative place, which we tend to associate with quite positive emotions. It's actually where difficult things are processed. So that may perhaps make sense from an artistic point of view, that sometimes, poetry can be very sad and pictures can be gloomy and photography can have a melancholic element to it. So it's necessary to have a balance of both. Otherwise, we live in one kind of la-la land, or we're in another where everything might look a little bit gloomy because we're not able to see the beautiful detail of something. And then I'm not going to go through all of these with you now. You can do that in your own time. But just to pick out a couple more, the left-hand side of the brain can read words. It knows what the shapes are that make up letters, and it can create a coherent word out of them. The right side understands what the word means. So if I'm just using the left hemisphere, I could perhaps read a text in some language I don't understand, like Bulgarian. And I would be able to spell my way through the words, but I would have no idea what it means. It's the right-hand side of the brain that brings the nuance and the understanding of words. And this kind of information about the brain has become more and more clear when you study people who have different types of injury, for example, strokes in the brain. You can see what kind of function is lost when they have that. I find it very interesting that the left-hand side of the brain both likes linear and logical thinking, which is part of the stereotype that we know about the left-hand side of the brain, and the right side likes abstract concepts. And at the same time, the left-hand side is very curious and impulsive. That's where those actions arise from. If we want to reach out and try something new because we see that detail in front of us, we go, what's that like? And the right side of the brain likes to be cautious, and it likes to take safe actions, because remember, the right side of the brain sees the big picture. So whereas the left-hand side of the brain might go, oh, look at that little red berry, I really want to take it and eat it. The right-hand side of the brain will be going, well, look, it's in a thorn bush, and there's a huge saber-toothed tiger sleeping in front of it. Maybe I shouldn't do that. So they balance themselves quite well, and it might seem like some of the functions that are lateralized, that means put to one side or the other in the brain, are a little bit contradictory. I find it interesting to consider what it is that these things have in common. And it's not as black and white as that previous picture I showed you would have you think. Okay, so we could spend ages on this slide, but we have to move on. So here we go. So what keeps the brain together? Well, that unenviable task goes to a structure called the corpus callosum. So here on the screen, we have a picture of a brain that has had the top section cut away so that we can see the deeper structures. And you can see in there what essentially looks like a bundle. And those white lines that go from the left to the right are white matter. So those are huge bundles of axons from neurons that are sitting over here in the grey matter and over here on the other side. And they are bundled together underneath the arc shape of the cingulate cortex. And they are essentially sending information from the left to the right. And that structure is essential for our brain to work well together. So in order to illustrate this for you, I'm going to tell you about what used to be done in extreme circumstances for people who had severe epilepsy. So this is people who would have seizures that were so severe that they would have an epileptic fit to the point where it would be dangerous because of the intensity and the amount of times per day it would be happening. And if that was incurable, they couldn't find any way to medicate for it or do anything else, they would slice through the corpus callosum. So they would cut through this bundle here. So now the left and right hemispheres no longer have that as a bridge of contact. That had quite unexpected effects. Now, while it did help the people with epilepsy in one hemisphere and stopped those seizures from going over into the other side, so the whole brain would go into this electrical storm and they would at least retain function on one side, it also created what was known as the alien hand syndrome. So what that looks like is if you are trying with one hand to button your shirt, that information, it's a little bit complicated, but it comes down from the left hemisphere to the right side of the body. And the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. There's a crossover that happens on the way down. Okay, so as I'm trying to unbutton this with my right hand, my left hand, because I've had this corpus callosum cut through, would come and undo the action of the other hand. And there would be a conflict between the intention of the two hands, which is quite wild if you think about it. So the same person is wanting to undo a button and the other hand of the same person is doing it up. And that's kind of maddening in a way. So what that began to indicate at that point to neuroscience, which is very exciting, is that all the time in the brain, there are lots of processes happening that are wanting to be carried out. It's a little bit like you're sitting with a team of 10 very enthusiastic advisors, and they all have totally different ideas about what should happen next. And one of them is saying, oh, do this up, and the other is saying, no, 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 you should definitely close it. And because they are not in communication, it's like now they're in different rooms. They're both remote controlling the body to do what they think it should be doing. So just imagine living like that for a little while. Thankfully, this corpus callosum is not the only connection between the two hemispheres. There are also other connections, commissures as they're called, that are at the front of the brain and at the back of the brain. So what used to happen after a few weeks is that these people who had the corpus callosectomy, this cutting of it, would start to behave more normally again with less seizures as those other connections in the brain started to pick up the slack. So you might remember what I said earlier about redundancy in the brain. It can, to some extent, make up for loss of function in some areas by reinforcing the function in other areas of the brain. So all of that to say, it's really good to have a corpus callosum that is functioning well so that the left and right can inform one another, so we can view the world in detail and have an overview and see words and understand them and have intellectual and emotional intelligence, and so forth and so forth. So we reached the first milestone now of the presentation, which is that the brain is made of connections. Okay. So, next stage. We know that the brain is made of connections, but how is information sent around the brain? What do those connections do? How do they work? So you may previously have heard of the term brainwaves. Now, when you have two neurons, as we saw on the previous slide, there are little buds on the dendrites and little terminals on the axons that somehow communicate information between them. And that space between the end of the dendrite and the end of the axon is called a synaptic cleft. So that's a little gap that's between them. This is the case for most neurons. So I'm generalizing a little bit here. Some neurons are actually in physical contact, but it's rare. Most of them, the vast majority, have a little gap between them. And when that information is passing from the end of the axon into the dendrite, that's called a synapse. So it's a kind of structure that allows for electrical or chemical information to be sent between neurons. Fine. But then, what is a brainwave? That is when there is more than 1,000 synapses firing together to the point where they're creating an oscillation of electrical activity. So remember earlier I said there's about 87 million neurons in the brain? Well, to get 1,000 of those firing together is actually not quite as impressive as it sounds. That's only a very small proportion. So if you can get 1,000 or more of them firing together in the same kind of area, so they're sending a strong signal. For example, you've just seen a saber-toothed tiger, and that information is definitely being sent to your conscious awareness from all of those filtering processes that are happening. That's probably more than 1,000 synapses that are all firing at the same time as you go, you turn your head and gasp and then start running or pass out, depending on how your fight or flight configured. So if you have a brainwave, that's another way of saying that there is an oscillation in electrical activity happening in the brain, because over that synapse, there's a tiny little change in the electrical current happening. So with 1,000 of them happening at the same time, it's enough to pick it up with an EEG sensor placed on the outside of the skull. And we'll get into that in detail later on. So brainwaves are essential to understand because it's how we learn. There is something called Hebb's rule, which is to do with synapses firing at the same time. And the Hebb's rule is what fires together wires together. So that means that when you're very young and you see your mother, and you might have a positive association with mother because she's warm and she feeds you and picks you up. You might have it with your father, you might have it with your siblings, with your dog, whoever. You're going to start associating certain things together because as you see who you know to be, let's say your mother, and you feel warmth on your skin, and there's your little tummy getting filled with milk and food, those neurons at that point are sending signals very strongly at the same time. And as they're firing at the same time, so they start to be more likely in future to fire together. And so this is also what's called conditioning. So, for example, if somebody starts to talk to you about some amazing cake, or they show you a picture of this amazing cake, you might find that your mouth starts to water. Why? There's no cake. But because you've got a history with cakes, maybe a smaller or larger history, then you've associated deliciousness with having this physical response. And that's because those synapses were firing at the same time in your taste buds and in your visual cortex and in your conceptual association with cake. So there's a whole network inside your brain that is dedicated to you enjoying the sight, the smell, the taste of cakes and associating all the other bits and pieces with that. And if you speak several languages, in your neural network to do with cake, you'll also have the name for cake in different languages. So what fires together wires together. And the more you do something, the more likely it is in future that when you have one thing that belongs to that network, to that association, all the rest of them will fire. Just think about somebody that you really like. You might know how their voice sounds. You can imagine that in your head. You might know how they walk. You might know how they dress. You might remember something that they've said, somewhere you met them last. All of that starts to fire together because you've associated them in your mind. When we first start to learn something, for example, if this is the first time you're hearing about neuroanatomy and neuroscience, I'm trying to create connections all the time, backwards and forwards between what we're talking about and bridges to your ordinary life, so you have connections. Because if we just spoke about this in theory without any connections backwards and forwards or sideways in your life, you would have nothing to attach it to, and that makes learning so much more difficult. So we are following the Hebs rule of what creates good learning in the brain, which is associative learning. Connect it to what you already know, and you'll be harnessing the power of your existing oscillations in the brain. Okay, so that's brainwaves. Now we have to talk about the speed of brainwaves. So the picture you see here on the screen isn't precise because it's a nice little kind of digital rendering, but it's giving you a sense of oscillations that are happening. So these curves that are on the screen are intending to represent the speed at which there is this kind of positive and negative current change in these synapses, in these brain waves that are happening. So you can see some of them are very fast. So there's some very fast polarizing and depolarizing, as it's called, going on here in this rhythm. And some of the other rhythms are much slower. So there's only one of those happening for perhaps every 3 of the others. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the detail. You can already see it here on the screen. The fastest brain waves that we have are called gamma. So this is a Greek letter that was chosen to represent these. And they oscillate. Oscillate means going up and down like this. So they're charging and decharging these electrical currents. They're doing that 30 to 100 times per second. A hertz means how many times something happens per second. So that's fast. Just consider that 100 times per second, right? So that kind of brainwave happens in the brain when we're doing learning and very high level processing of information. And there are specific bands within that, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, where there is a band of gamma frequency between 38 and 42 hertz that is related to how the brain sends sensory and cognitive information around the brain. So it's almost like the brainwave frequency is used as a kind of language or a signature for one part of the brain to send and another part of the brain to receive. So for example, if I am seeing a cake, that sight information is going somewhere in my brain encoded in this gamma frequency, and the taste of the cake is being encoded in a similar frequency, and that then meets in a structure in my brain called the thalamus. And from there, I'm creating my picture of reality going, oh, it looks like a cake, it tastes like a cake, I guess I will label it cake. So it's almost like a similar language that our different senses use to collate information so that it can create a coherent picture of reality. So then we slow down a little bit. It's quite rare to be in gamma, except if you're doing very high level learning. So another thing just to point out before I say anything else is your whole brain is not ever in one brainwave state. So people say, oh, there's a beta wave state in the brain. That may be true, but it's going to be in an area of the brain or between specific structures. So the brain of this rendering we're seeing here on the screen, this person doesn't have a brain that is in just gamma wave state. There might be some sensory information that's being processed and sent around in this gamma frequency, these oscillations, these brain waves between the neurons. But at the same time, in other parts of the brain, there's going to be some beta wave, some alpha wave, some theta wave, some delta wave happening, because all of those languages are happening in the brain at the same time to deal with all the processes that you're doing right now, even as you're sitting here looking, taking in information. There's a lot of different processes happening at the same time. You're breathing, I hope. That's done via the brainstem. That's a different speed of processing to the way in which, probably using a beta frequency, you're taking in my words and creating some association with something and then either choosing to remember that or letting it go out the other ear if you're in a little bit of overwhelm or if you're tired. So just an example, lots of things happening at the same time. So the next frequency down from gamma wave is beta wave. That's between 13 and 30 oscillations per second, still very fast. And we use that when we're in an alert state, or if we are doing what's called critical reasoning, which is about taking in information, weighing it up, analyzing, seeing if we like it or not. Do we get rid of it? Do we connect it to something that we like? We spend a lot of our day in beta wave state, and if we do it for too long, we can't sustain it anymore. And that's when we zone out. When we zone out, we kind of remove ourselves from this beta wave function in a certain part of our brain, and we allow slower functions to take over, to integrate what it is we're hearing, or just go somewhere else until we're ready to have the kind of energy you need to be in a beta wave state. Because of course, to sustain one of these higher brainwave states, gamma or beta, you need a lot of fuel for the brain. The brain only takes up about 1% of your total body mass, but it uses a quarter of the energy of your body. So it's not really sustainable for the brain to be in these gamma and beta wave states overall for long periods because it uses all the reserves. So sometimes when we zone out, it's completely normal because we need to go into a lower speed so that we can replenish the supplies that we've used up with the faster processing. So then we carry on down the scale, alpha wave brain waves. That's when we go into a more relaxed, imaginative, intuitive, daydreaming type state. So that's a state that you're going to be in many times a day when you are just vaguing out a little bit and you suddenly go, oh, what was I doing? And it's the state we all go through before we fall asleep. So that kind of time where you don't quite realize that you're falling asleep and suddenly your head goes like that, boing, and you go, oh, where was I? So that's when you've changed into an alpha wave state in certain parts of your brain. And then even slower than that, theta wave. So you can experience that when you're sleeping, for sure. It's what REM, rapid eye movement dreaming, happens in. And it's also a brainwave state we use when we're awake, when there are multiple areas of the brain that are talking together. So I gave the example earlier with gamma wave and said that's a way that sensory information is connected together, right, as gamma language. Theta wave also does that, but between superficial and deep areas of the brain. So it's really a brainwave frequency you see when people are in deep meditative states, when they are in a position of gaining access to deeper places in themselves that they absolutely cannot access when they're in beta wave. It doesn't allow it. It doesn't allow those sorts of connections we need to make down into the deeper levels of our consciousness. You could say in a way that beta brainwave states are our conscious mind, and alpha is the subconscious. And you could say that theta brainwave states is more of a superconscious state where we're in touch with a transpersonal space, the collective consciousness, if you like. We'll get more into that later on. And then finally, delta waves. These are the slowest. They only happen between 1 and 4 times a second, which for the brain is really slow. They happen those few times a night when we go into a deep dreamless sleep. So during our sleep at night, we come up and down through different brainwave frequencies, depending on how deeply we are asleep. And being in a theta or delta state is very healing for the mind. It allows for a lot of repair to be done. It's very rare to access that when you're awake, very rare. I've seen it done by somebody who was in a trance doing spiritual mediumship. And I have read reports of people doing this when they're in a transcendental meditation state. For most of us, that's not easily attainable. So that just gives you a sense of the range and function of these brainwaves that we have in our mind. And hopefully now you're getting a little bit of a sense of what they actually refer to. Synapses happening in the brain between neurons, thousands of them happening at a time in different areas of the brain communicating together. Okay, hanging in there. You're doing well if you're still listening. So now I've got something that's going to start to get us more towards the spiritual aspect of this presentation today. And this is something called hemicoherence. So what that refers to is when there is a synchronization of alpha brain waves, okay, so quite slow ones, the ones when we're daydreaming, when we're kind of more expanded than our normal analytical critical self, between the left and right hemispheres. So it means that the alpha frequency is synchronizing in the left and right hemispheres. That's a useful thing because it means that information can pass over and there isn't one hemisphere running the show, which we've seen before when people have the corpus callosectomy. can lead us to all kinds of problems. Even if ours isn't cut through, it can create quite a disordered person. Now, there's a very interesting piece of research done with EEG where they measured somebody who was a Zen master, a Zen Roshi, and they found that he had what they call a bimodal coherence brainwave pattern, which essentially means that as they were measuring the left and right hemispheres of this Zen Roshi, they saw that there were big alpha waves and then small alpha waves. Big alpha waves, small alpha waves. Remember, the name of the wave, beta, alpha, theta, etc., isn't to do with the size, it's to do with the speed. So you could have very big alpha waves or very small ones, but it's the speed by which we give them that name. So he had what was called this bimodal coherence, which means that the big waves and the small waves were consistent. So all of the big waves were of a certain big size and the small ones were of a certain small size. So there was a clear pattern going on, which is why it's called bimodal. This is to do with statistics, but bi means that there's two, and modal is to do with what is the biggest presence of something. And so there were two things that had a large presence, small brain waves and large brain waves in this alpha frequency. And this was unusual. This hadn't been measured before. Now, the story goes that this Zen Roshi passed over some years later. And on his deathbed, as a good Zen master should, he had his disciples around him. And at the moment where he chose to pass over, there was a transmission that happened energetically to one of his disciples who he had chosen to be his successor, the new Zen Roshi. And 7 years later, this new Zen Roshi turned up in the lab, and they saw, when they measured his brain, that he had the exact same bimodal coherence in his brainwave patterns. The other 29 disciples of this Zen Roshi didn't have it. So there's something unusual about this that is connected to a certain spiritual ability, you might say. And there was a way in which that transmitted. Perhaps it was through the intensity of this disciple's practice, but the people who were present at the deathbed said there was definitely something tangible that moved through the room at that time. So the Zen Roshi I've shown here on the slide, I don't know whether that's the one this study was done by, but when I saw this picture, I look at him and there's just something that emanates from him that tells me, you know, this is somebody who has a great deal of coherence in him. There seems to be a real peace around him. So that's pretty cool. Now, we take this a little bit further. So what about halos? There is, of course, through history and through art, this idea that saints and prophets and people who had a certain spiritual ability or connection would be drawn with this light emanating from their heads. Don't ask me too much about the detail of this because I'm not a mathematician and I'm not a physicist, but I'm going to do my best to explain this to you. The idea is that brainwave frequencies follow approximately the Fibonacci scaling. So Fibonacci is this, so 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13. So some of those numbers come up when you look at the brainwave frequencies in some kind of ratio. Okay. So apparently, if you have a Fibonacci scaling in what's called phase space, and it's the kind of space that you have around the head. It's invisible to some of us and visible to others. It's to do with the speed at which our brainwave patterns is going. So if you have an EEG, you can see this. You can see the different phases that are going on at the same time, the speed of the oscillations, if you like. That phase space around the head of somebody who has this bimodal coherence pattern going on creates a toroidal field, a torus. That's the mathematical term for something that looks like a donut. So it's a kind of a 3D ring with a hole in the middle, right? So like I'm showing here on the screen. So if somebody has that bimodal pattern, then they would have this in this phase space around their head. And the size and orientation of that torus depends on the frequencies, the distribution of those brain waves underneath. It does look uncannily like a halo. What has been shown in studies, and I've given you the reference on the screen here by a neuroscientist called James Hart in Germany. He's done research on this for decades, and he runs a brainwave training program called BioCybernaut. And he has found that you can actually teach people how to get their brain into this bimodal coherency pattern. You can learn how to do that. It takes a number of hours of training. I think it's 60 to 90 hours where you have to learn how to get your brain into this alpha wave pattern and how to get the coherency going on. But isn't it interesting to consider that if you could learn to, on purpose, go to that brainwave state, wouldn't you also then be able to access the state of awareness that goes with having this toroidal shape / halo around your head? So is learning to control our brainwaves a way to access that kind of spiritual transcendence that we see through history in some of these pictures I've shown here on the screen? There's the Buddha sitting under the tree, there's Krishna with the halo, and of course Jesus Christ with the halo. So that opens a very interesting line of inquiry about what kind of qualities we might gain from entering into that same mode that the Zen master was also able to ascertain and pass on to his successors. Just to give you a little taste of what we can do with the brain, because now we're all thinking, wouldn't it be great if I could have a halo next time someone took a picture or drew a portrait of me? Let me show you a video here, and I hope you'll be able to hear this, on neuroplasticity.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So that's good news for those of us who wish to improve ourselves through our lifetime, that we have the opportunity to change the patterning that has been laid down for us in earlier life. And developing a halo is just one of the many possibilities that that gives us. So we're almost now at the end of this first segment. We're going to have a break in just a moment, but let me sum up for you what we've learnt so far. That the brain is made of connections, and those connections change depending on how we use the brain. And so now we're going to have a little break for 5 minutes, and you're welcome to type any questions in the chat area in the meantime. I also really encourage you to move your body, breathe, get a drink, allow yourself to replenish yourselves a little bit so that you don't run out of beta wave processing power while we warm up for the next part of the presentation. Okay, hello everybody, we're back again. So we've got some intelligent, wonderful questions here. Let me see if I can say anything equally intelligent in return. So considering neuroplasticity, does it take longer to create new neural pathways for emotional, physical, or spiritual pathways? And does longevity in pre-programming make any difference? Well, I'll tell you what, we are, as human beings, created to preserve energy. And like I told you before, being in a beta or gamma brainwave state takes a lot of energy. It burns a lot of oxygen and glucose in the brain. And in order to make a change to a neural pathway, as you just saw in the video, you have to, first of all, realize that there is a pattern going on and have the will to change it. So we have to motivate ourselves, which takes energy in the first place. If a habit is really ingrained, of course, even building awareness that it's there and then the volition, the willingness to change it, takes something. If a habit has been going on for a long period of time, it's going to take much more of a consistent effort to change it than if it's something you've just been doing over a short period of time, because it's not as associated with other things in your mind. And if you consider people who have addiction problems, this is really obvious. For example, for people who have been smokers, there's a whole ritual that goes around that. Carrying the cigarettes around, having something between your fingers, associating it with coffee or being outside in certain places or doing certain activities, and then smoking would follow. All of that creates a kind of association network, a neural network in the brain, where when those things are happening, or any one of them, there's a strong oscillation that goes over to the node that's called get a cigarette now and smoke it. So the more associated, the more entangled our habits are, so the neural networks are very strong, they've got a lot of white matter connection between them in those cases, the more effort it is to try and undo them. Now, I don't know whether there is any difference in terms of emotional, physical, and spiritual pathways, because from my understanding, there's a lot of overlap between many pathways in the brain, and there are parts of the brain that are recycled for different purposes in the same place. To give you an example, there's a part of the brain where we sense pain. This is in the parietal cortex, which we're going to learn about just in a moment. And that part of the brain both senses pain when we hurt ourselves, we cut ourselves. It's also where that part of the brain lights up and we feel pain when we see another being hurt. So it's also empathic pain that's done in the same place. And it's where we feel pain when we've been abandoned or isolated or betrayed by other people, emotional pain. So the same networks can carry a kind of information that is physical, emotional, and spiritual at the same time, just depending on the context in which it's happening. So, like I said earlier, we are made to preserve energy because back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers, making sure the bears weren't coming and finding our berries and all that, we weren't sure where our next meal was coming from. So our system is really well made to try and preserve energy and not waste it. So it's the same with our neural pathways. The brain doesn't like to waste energy on taking apart something that functions perfectly well, i.e. a bad habit, and then try and spend energy to build a new pathway and then even more energy to consolidate that new pathway and choose it over and over instead of the old one. So it's not easy. Habits are best broken a little bit at a time. They say 10% per week is a good way in which to change a habit, so it's not overwhelming. And there are, of course, those who like to go cold turkey, and then the brain just has to cope with that, although the whole system might be screaming about it. And so another question, is there a certain brainwave that increases neuroplasticity? Yes, there is. Theta wave is ideal for neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity has been used now in Canada and the United States to treat people with depression. So you can go into a theta wave brain clinic. You have to pay, and you sit in a chair, and they have a certain device, which we're going to discover in another part of this presentation today, where they induce a theta brainwave state in you. And that both helps the brain to heal, which means to clean up old debris from connections that aren't used, to restore the neurotransmitter levels that have got a little bit low when the fuel runs out and all that. So theta wave is the best neuroplastic wave. What else? Do certain brain waves help create integrated fibers between different parts of the brain? That's exactly the same as neuroplasticity. So theta wave is a good one for that. And does a longer incised neuropathway take longer to change? Well, again, it depends on what it's connected with, because remember that the brain has networks, right? So there might be one pathway going from point A to point B, but it's probably got associations coming in from point C, D, and D along the way. So there are some networks that are very local, that only cover small areas. But as we grow older into adults, most of our networks, actually, the distinguishing feature is an adult brain has bigger networks that cover larger areas. When we're children, the networks are really small, just mostly around the gray matter in the top part of the cortex on the outside of the brain, but it's a kind of distinguishing feature of adulthood that we start to connect things really quickly. For example, when you learn to drive, that's totally overwhelming to begin with because it's not all connected, but it becomes like a subconscious skill because those networks are doing it for you so quickly. So if it is longer, maybe it takes longer to change, but it depends how many connections there are that might also need changing along the way and deconnecting. Could be a very thin, long pathway, but a really massive, short one. Is thought myelinated or just movement is another question. Thought and movement are both myelinated. So the long neurons that go down the body, they have myelination, and all of that white matter inside of the brain is myelination. So, for example, one of the networks that runs in the mind is called the attentional network, and it helps us pay attention to things that kind of pop up that need our attention. Someone goes, hey, well, there's suddenly some movement. So there's a network that's constantly tracking for those. That's a very, very fast network. So it wouldn't make any sense I suppose we wouldn't have survived if that network wasn't as fast as possible. So we are the product of millennia of evolution, I guess, selecting the humans at the time who were most successful, and having that kind of speed of processing really helps. So it's both thought and movement. Are there any spiritual parts of the brain, or what we call spiritual, more of a particular pattern in the brain? There are spiritual centers in the brain. We're going to be viewing some of them today as we get into the neuroscience methods. There are certain areas that show up again and again when there are studies done on people's own experience of spirituality, and when you see people experiencing it and you're measuring from the outside what's happening. So both in what they report for themselves and what we see from the outside, there are certain areas that tend to light up. And we're going to see this as we go into the next part of the presentation now. It's not just about where the things are in the brain, but the connections between them that really make the magic happen. Isn't pain experienced at the right anterior insula along with other affective valence? Yes, and the pain network is bigger than the right anterior insula. If you think about it, pain also has to show up in the sensory cortex first before it becomes interpreted as pain. In fact, in the brain, it's a weird thing. There isn't pain per se. There is only what the brain associates with pain, particularly if there's a negative valence, or this quality of a negative emotion attached to it. So the pain network includes the right anterior insula and the parietal cortex in the somatosensory cortex, where there is some kind of activation happening. So the right anterior insula, from what I remember, putting me on the spot now, but I think that's also part of the same network as what is experienced with physical pain, but I would need to look that up. But so consider that it's part of a network, what we experience as pain in the brain. Pain doesn't exist per se in a specific location. It's connected to other things. Okay, so let's go bravely forwards now into the next part of the presentation. So we need to go through the different parts of the brain. We'll do that quite quickly. We're over halfway through the seminar now. You're all hanging in there and asking intelligent questions. I'm very impressed with you. Did you prepare those before coming? Very insightful. So we're going to go through the different parts of the brain, and then we're going to go straight into the first neuroscience method, which will be fMRI. But because fMRI looks at the brain and shows what's happening in different parts, I just want to give you a little bit more sense of what the different parts of the brain are kind of doing, so we know the territory that we're moving around. So what I've done to give you some good associative learning is to give a character to each of the parts of the brain we're going to look at. Now, This is truly just the world according to Marcus. This is not a hard and fast rule. You won't find this anywhere else. I just put this together because it helps me remember stuff if I associate it to some kind of person or personality or story. That's how my brain is wired. I remember things about people and not so much what they're called or what they look like, but more, how they are and how they interact with others. So these are my characters that we're going to use to associate the functions of different parts of the brain. So we start with the frontal lobe. The name gives it away. The frontal lobe is at the front of the brain. So it's here behind the forehead and it stretches back to this midriff, this sulcus that goes down the middle of the brain, and then it goes forward here. So all of this part here of the brain is actually a very large lobe. And I thought, well, it reminds me of a chief executive, multitasking, doing all of these skills. You'll see why in just a moment. So the frontal lobe can be broken down into different sub-areas. You do not need to remember or fully understand all of these as we go forward, but for those of you who are interested, I'll quickly talk you through them. So the frontal lobe includes, just behind the central sulcus, what's called the primary motor area. And connections come out of the primary motor area and go down into the body. So that's where signals are coming from that's telling my hand to move right now. That's where we execute movement. Then right in front of that, this blue area on the screen is where we plan movement. So this is fascinating. When you get people who are planning to do something, for example, a professional skier will be standing at the top of the ski slope and looking down, and then in their mind's eye going through the twists and turns of the slalom that they're going to do, you see the areas light up in this premotor cortex as though they were going to do the action. So even though they're not moving at all. So it's like the action is there and open and ready, and all that needs to happen is to flick into the primary motor cortex, and then it can get executed. The frontal lobe is very much in charge of deciding our movement and whether we move or not. So then moving further forward in the frontal lobe, just like a boss, decides where you go and what you're going to do and what you might do and can you have holiday or not. So the green area at the front of the brain is the lateral prefrontal cortex. So the brains that you're seeing on the screen right now are shown, the top one is from the side, and the lower one is a section through the middle of the brain. So that's, you're seeing the inside of the right hemisphere there. So you can see the green area only appears on the top one because it's lateral. That means it's on the side of the brain. And that's where executive functions are mainly carried out. And executive functions means stuff like prioritizing the incoming tasks, knowing what order to do them in, shifting between sets, so paying attention to one thing and then another, and then also deciding what it is that you shouldn't be doing, which connects to the area just below it. So the yellow area on your screen, which is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That is an area that you can see on brain scans changing size when somebody does a lot of mindfulness. And this will make sense in just a moment when I tell you what that part of the brain does. It's to do with inhibition, which is when we stop ourselves from doing something. Remember the people with the alien hand syndrome where they're doing two different things? There's probably many of us who sometimes feel a little bit paradoxical and we kind of want something, but we don't and we shouldn't, and maybe we could anyway. So this part of the brain helps us to allow for one course of action to be followed while we inhibit another one. It also helps us with our decision making, weighing up facts, and it processes the risks and the amount of fear involved in something. So we kind of go, well, is it worth my while given the risk and the fear that I'm feeling with this? So if you do a lot of mindfulness, you will do several things. You will lower the amount of anxiety that your system generally feels because you are not going into an automatic fear response about things, but instead allowing thoughts, sensations to arise and also letting go of them again. And you'll become better at inhibiting automatic reactions, sort of like knee-jerk reactions when something happens. So it's an area you can literally see it growing bigger when you take brain scans of people over a period of time when they're doing intensive mindfulness. For those of you who might now want to do that, intensive mindfulness means at least 30 minutes a day, ideally 40 minutes a day, for 8 weeks, every day. That's what an intensive period of mindfulness to really generate neuroplasticity and support the new connections would look like. And then finally, the anterior cingulate cortex, we saw that earlier, part of that, when we were looking at the corpus callosum, which is what kind of connects the two hemispheres, and the anterior cingulate cortex wraps around it. So it's part of the band that holds it together, and you can see it's further inside the brain. And in there, there is information received about blood pressure regulation, heart rate, emotion, rewards. Do we think we're going to get a reward out of something? And controlling impulses. So you could say that part of the frontal cortex is the more emotional aspect, or the bridge between the thinking and the emotion and how our body is responding to it. Okay, so it's a quick run through of the frontal lobe, but just remember, this is where decisions are made, where actions are carried out, where we plan ahead. And it's a part of the brain that continues to develop and grow more connections through life, which is essentially why we tend to elect older people to lead us as statespeople, hoping that that part of the brain in them has better analysis, inhibition, and, for example, priority setting and set shifting, which is unfortunately not always the case. Moving on swiftly now. So another system I want you to know about is the limbic system. We started to come close to that as we looked at the cingulate cortex just now. I like to call this the Tasmanian devil. So this is different to anything that makes a rational decision. It's something that works purely on emotion and basic impulses. So looking at that in a bit more detail, there is a collection of structures there essentially. So it's not a lobe like the frontal lobe. We saw in the picture earlier, there's a kind of central sulcus in front of which the frontal lobe is placed. But here it's more of a system of different structures. So it used to be called a lobe, but now it's named a system. And some of those structures, for those of you who are interested, include the olfactory bulbs. So that's what brings our sense of smell deeper into the brain, which is very emotional. There is a way that smell can bring up emotion in us that few other senses can do quite so vividly. It's also directly connected to why we can use smell to rouse people. For example, if they faint, you can use smelling salts, and that gets a very strong response out of the system that you might not get if you're kind of slapping them around or, you know, trying to shout at them, because the sense of smell is the only sense that's not processed by a central structure in the brain called the thalamus. So sense, the olfactory sense, bypasses that and goes straight into the limbic system. So we can have a very strong emotional response without any pre-processing whatsoever. Another part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is named accordingly because in Latin, hippocampus means a seahorse. And back in the day when they were first chopping up those brains and calling things white matter and grey matter, when they dissected that part, in section, it looked like a little seahorse. So they thought, aha, let's call it hippocampus. But in fact, the function of it has nothing to do with the seahorses, really. It's related to memory. So any London taxi driver who's been reading anything over the last 20 years will tell you that they have larger brains than other people in the population. And that's because to become a London taxi driver, you have to do 3 to 4 years of the knowledge, where you drive around the streets of London, essentially memorizing loads of routes. I don't even know how many it is. And as they do that, they are increasing their spatial memory. And the hippocampus contains the spatial memory, so the hippocampus grows. And consequently, the overall brain volume is larger because the hippocampus has got larger. It's also interesting that part of the brain continues to have genesis of new cells. Most parts of the brain don't have that. The brain can make new connections or change connections, but actually to get new cells is very limited as adults. As babies, we can because we have stem cells, but the hippocampus contains basic stem cells that can create new neurons. So that's why we can go into new places and learn the layouts of new things. And if we expose ourselves to going into lots of new places, particularly when we're doing some exercise and running around and getting lots of blood flow and oxygen in our system, we are encouraging the genesis of new cells in the hippocampus, and that can counteract some of the effects of aging. That's covered in the next seminar that I do, which is Neuroscience and Body Mind. So a few other structures also in the limbic system, the hypothalamus, which is a place where there's lots of different types of hormones that are secreted, and the amygdala, which is a little bit like a smoke detector in the brain. It looks out for incoming signals that might be dangerous, and if it considers anything dangerous, it does two things. It sends a very strong signal to the frontal lobe, goes attention, attention, and it helps us write that experience into memory much more strongly. So as we go through life, we don't tend to remember boring days where nothing happened. We tend to remember strong emotional experiences. And that's because of this modulation that the amygdala does. And when that gets activated, we remember things much better, which serves an evolutionary purpose, of course, because if you go out about as a hunter-gatherer and you tend to stumble over places where there are saber-toothed tigers and bears hiding, you might have a bit of an emotional reaction to that, and it's in your best interest to remember where that was. So another evolutionary function. So if you want to try and remember something, the best thing that you can do is make a little emotional story out of it, which is why I do this thing with the little characters. So in summary, the limbic system has emotional functions, behavioral functions, it has motivational functions, it helps us make long-term memories, and it's related to smell as well. So you can see the kind of Tasmanian devil traits there, the emotion, the behavior that may or may not be stopped, the motivation to do things, particularly if it's a bit of a primal drive, long-term memories about where the goodies are and where the danger is, and then smelling things. The limbic system has been examined in a lot of detail by Daniel Siegel, who is a very well-known neuroscientist and medical doctor as well, who teaches about this extensively. I highly recommend his online teaching seminars, his books. And he likes to teach the limbic system by showing a hand. So you can see the similarity between this hand and the one on the screen. That's my hand there. So if you tuck your thumb inside your fingers and fold them over, as such, you have a model of the brain. And on that model of the brain, the wrist that comes up represents the spinal cord. So the spinal cord and then the brainstem here at the base of the hand, just inside the palm, a very primitive part of the brain that lizards have. It's where we breathe from, it's where our pulse keeps beating from. So as you can see in the picture over on the left, the colored areas represent the limbic system, and the cortex, which is all this kind of windy, sinewy stuff on top, wraps around it. So what happens when we are having a strong emotional reaction to something is that the connections between the cortex here on the front that are supposed to make us prioritize and inhibit and make good decisions, those connections temporarily don't function very well. And it's almost like, as Daniel Siegel says, we flip our lid. And at that point, we don't really have much sensical ability. We just react a little bit like a Tasmanian devil because now the limbic system is in control. It's also what's known as the mammalian brain. So it's kind of more basic impulses, more sophisticated than perhaps the lizard, but still not what you want running the show all the time. And then after a period of time, when we calm down again, those connections between the frontal lobe and the limbic system reassert themselves, and we start to be able to do what's called regulating our behavior. So basically, we calm down and we stop seeing red, and then we can take some normal, socially engaged steps again. So that's just a very quick run through of the limbic system. So moving on, the parietal lobe. I'm not quite sure whether this is the best character ever to describe it, but I couldn't find anything better. So I went with the contortionist. For two reasons. She kind of wraps herself around in strange shapes, which we'll see in a minute why that makes sense for the parietal lobe. And she is able to know how she's configured in space. Even though her feet are somewhere the wrong side of her head, she can sense that even if her eye is closed, as can you if you close your eyes. You know where your body is in space, even though you're not looking at it. So the parietal lobe, the name comes from the Latin word paris, which means wall, and it was given the name of wall because the cranium was considered to be a wall over that top of over the top of the head, and this lobe sits underneath that wall. So it got to be called the parietal lobe by extension. Nothing to do with its function. So what it essentially does, that part of the brain that sits behind that middle sulcus there, that the frontal lobe is in front of, the parietal lobe integrates sensory information from the body. And that includes the spatial sense, which means you know where you are in space. I know that my legs are kind of in a 90-degree configuration right now, sitting down, and I can navigate. I know where my left and my right are, and that's called proprioception if you add it all together. People who have damage to this part of the brain, it's very interesting to watch them moving around because they can't walk without looking at their feet. Because they can't sense how their body is configured in space, they have to look. So they have to lift one foot carefully, look at it moving forward to see where it is in space, put it down, shift their balance forward. So it's very laborious, but it can be done. So I think we take this sense very much for granted. Sometimes proprioception is called the sixth sense, not in a kind of spooky, eerie way, but just because it is a sense alongside hearing, taste, smell, sight, etc. It's also in the parietal lobe that major sensory inputs come from the body. So touch, temperature, pain, all of that goes through the thalamus to the parietal lobe. Okay, so we know something about our environment and how we are configured in it because this parietal lobe does that work of integration. And if you were to cut through the parietal lobe from front to back, there is a specific layout on this, what's called the somatosensory cortex, where the whole body is configured. So what we're looking at right now is the right hemisphere seen from the back, and it's cut through in the middle of the head like this. And where the foot is here on this picture is inside the central sulcus that runs inside the head. So a little bit further down is where the corpus callosum is. Okay, so give you some orientation. So the body has specific parts of the brain that respond to it. So if somebody is touching your toes and it says genitals right next to that, which is interesting, some people have crossovers between the sensations there. So if somebody is touching your feet and your toes, that is the part of the brain that will light up. Obviously, there isn't a person draped over your head, as you can imagine. This is just an illustration to show you what parts of the body are configured where on the brain. So if somebody, for example, has a stroke, in this area here of the brain, kind of halfway down the outside, they wouldn't be able to get any feeling from their hands. They wouldn't be able to feel touch or pain or temperature if that part was damaged. Okay, and you can see that different parts of the body have different sizes on here, and that can be illustrated in what's called a homunculus, which is essentially a little man that looks a little bit like this, but is kind of more like a little figurine, and he has enormous hands and very big lips, quite big feet, and a very small torso, because those parts of the body that are bigger are able to feel more. And you can demonstrate this on yourself right now if you want to. If you get two pointy things, like two pens, for example, or two chopsticks, or whatever you may have to hand, and you point those inside your palm so that they're about 1 centimeter apart. So I'm just doing that now. I don't know if you can see. So here we are. I'm doing that. So they're about 1 centimeter apart. I close my eyes and I can distinctly feel 2 points of pressure. I know that there's 2 points there. However, if I take the same distance and I move that to my back, I'm going to be careful not to draw on myself now, and I apply those, I feel 1 point of pressure. That's because there's a lot less sensory innervation, a lot less richness of receptors in those areas, and therefore that part of the brain is much smaller. Okay, so you can experiment with that and see if you're kind of hypersensitive in any area of your body. The lips are also a very, very sensitive area where you'll feel 2 points, even if they're just a few millimeters apart. All right, so we need to we need to move on. Some of you are experimenting there, I see. So we're going to move on to the temporal lobe because we need to get to the juicy bits now. We've got just under an hour left, so we need to get to the science parts. So the temporal lobe is an area of the brain. I call it the journalist because it's those are the functions that I see that this place has. It's where we hear and understand words. It's where we also recognize faces and scenes and objects, and it's what helps us to make new memories. Memories don't stay just in the hippocampus. There is again this idea of redundancy that happens in the brain. When a new memory is made, within a couple of days, there will be connections made up to the cortex and association networks. So that's why when we first try to learn something, it's most fragile until we connect it to more things that we know. This is also why when we get old and people with memory problems, dementia, they tend to lose the memories from their later life before they lose the earlier ones, because the earlier ones they'll have experienced more vividly, And then they've also repeated them and told them and been told them more times. So they have more of an associative network than later experiences. Just think about last week. Can you say in detail, without looking at any calendar, what you were doing every day? So it's fresh, and so it's not necessarily written as deep into your mind unless you really make an effort to remember it. So the hippocampus helps with all of those functions. You see why the journalist is an apt description of this lobe, because it's about hearing and understanding words, knowing who people are with their faces, knowing what scenes and objects are, and creating new memories. Okay, so just going a little bit fast through this now so we can get to the next section. But here's just a diagram to show you how we like to categorize parts of the brain with different functions. So for example, on this screen, there's a bit here close to the middle called listening to a bird song. I listen to a bird song. That's because it's in the temporal lobe, which is where we take in sound. And we can then hear what is music and what is words, etc. So there's also down here, I know the names of all the planets because it's to do with the hippocampus, the temporal lobe. And here at the front, there's I have an identity, I can solve problems, I understand reason and logic, all frontal lobe functions. And back here, I feel the warm sun on my face, a parietal lobe function from the somatosensory cortex. And back here, we won't talk about this today, but is the occipital cortex where the visual sense is processed. So where we see our surroundings. And then the cerebellum down here. Again, that's not for today, but that's where we learn repetitive movements, where we have patterns of things we do, for example, dribbling a basketball or skiing or whatever you do that's a learned sequence like riding a bicycle. So just to check you're still all with me and hanging in there, what color of brain tissue would a connection between two areas be? Would it be white or gray? There's at least a couple of people here who are completely on it and typing things into the chat. Well done. So a connection between two brain areas would indeed be white. So gray is the small areas around the outside, and connections are myelinated, therefore they're white. Okay, moving on now. So milestone number 3, some areas of the brain are specialized. We've just gone through all the lobes, and you've seen how some of them do specific things, and a lot of the brain is also to do with networks. So now we need to get into the neuroscience. Time is ticking, so we're going to get onto the fMRI now. We have some really strong basis for understanding these studies. fMRI, what is it and what's it used for? Well, what an fMRI approach in neuroscience can do is tell you where something is happening in the brain, the locality. The way it works is the body is placed inside a big machine that has a strong magnet. And that magnet is able to measure the changes in blood flow because blood is slightly more magnetic when it's deoxygenated. So this is a whole physical explanation we could get into, but just know that when blood is carrying oxygen, it's less magnetic than when it has got rid of the oxygen. So therefore, it makes sense that if an area is working really hard and it's using a lot of supplies, a lot of oxygen, you're going to get more magnetic blood cells there because they've offloaded the oxygen that they were carrying. So you can see on these fMRI scans areas that are being very active because there's more deoxygenated blood. It's not brilliant, this technique. It's been really refined over the last few decades, and maybe one day it will be super, super precise. But at the moment, the best that it can do in terms of localizing activity is within a few millimeters. So it can't, and if you think about it, in a cubic millimeter or so of brain tissue, there could be 1,000, 5,000 neurons happening. So it doesn't give you super detail, but it gives you at least a sense. And it can't show you specifically what is happening at a very precise moment, but it can give you something over a few seconds unless you use very specific techniques to do with putting radioactive substances in somebody's bloodstream. So overall, an fMRI shows you more or less where something is happening in the brain. I would like to show you a video. So in the meantime, there's a question here. So why, when you're doing fMRIs, do they ask you to do something and then imagine you doing it? So fMRI never makes sense on its own. You can't just take an fMRI picture of the brain and get anything out of it. You have to have a baseline. So what's the person doing when they're not doing that thing? Now, the problem is the brain is never doing nothing. If your brain is doing nothing, you're dead, or you're in such a deep coma that you're probably being ventilated and you would be dead. So probably doing fMRI is what are you comparing to? Because even if you tell somebody in an fMRI machine, just do nothing, they're going to be thinking of something. I mean, have you tried to meditate? How long can you keep your mind blank? So it's very difficult to know when you're comparing one fMRI picture to another, what is actually related to the function that you're trying to observe. So this is a whole dilemma in neuroscience about the usefulness of fMRI, but it's the best that we have for now. So now I'd like to show you this video, which has a Sufi ritual on it that was studied using fMRI. So let's play this. Okay, so that shows you the Sufist ritual of the zikr, where there is an intention to create a state of unity with God and experience that in an embodied way. So what Andrew Newberg did was he decided to do fMRI studies, which we now know how it works more or less, on people who were doing this zikr ritual. And he scanned them before and he scanned them during that prayer. So what you can see on the screen on the left is the baseline scan. The red areas are more active and the blue areas are less active. And in between we have some orange and yellow. And then on the right of the screen is the prayer scan, so the pattern of activations that happen during it. And what they showed, these scans, was that there was actually in the frontal lobe, so in the front part of the brain, a dramatic decrease in activity. And what that does when we stop having this chief executive who's kind of telling us what to do and planning everything for us and deciding whether we should inhibit something or not, is that we get increased access to states of imagination. So you can probably see that there at the front that it's more just yellow and orange, whereas on the baseline scan there's more red activity. And it also showed that on the right lobe there was decreased activity in comparison to the left. So if you can see there's less here on the right hand side than there is on the left, and there's certainly less than there was here before. The right lobe, if you'll remember from when I talked to you about the hemispheres, is connected to negative thinking and worry. So this ritual not only stops that kind of inner voice that inhibits and makes us think about thinking and all this stuff. So it opens up to creative states of imagination. But it also decreased the amount of negative thinking and worry. So people who do this have less pessimism and improvements in mental health. And that was in the frontal lobe. In the parietal lobe, so in this rear part here of the brain behind the midline, this activity there was also less activity after 50 to 60 minutes of chanting. So of course these scans had to be done where they were not moving. So they made them do the ritual and then pulled them out of the ritual straight into the MRI and then put them back into it. You can't do an MRI scan if somebody's in the process of moving. So after 50 to 60 minutes of doing this chant and this movement, there was a drop in activity in the parietal lobe. That's quite clear to see across this whole area. There's a lot more green and yellow in comparison to before. And that is similar to what you see on MRI scans of Franciscan nuns who are praying and Buddhist meditators. After about 50 to 60 minutes, it seems to be the magic time for there to be this drastic drop in activity, which has become associated with having spiritual experiences. So that hour kind of caught my imagination, and there is an old poem by William Blake that says, "To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." So it is possible for us with certain spiritual rituals to hold eternity in ourselves within an hour of practice. So when we have certain contemplative practices, such as mindfulness, that allows us to accept ourselves for who we are. So if you like, our sense of ourself has a neural network. And when we practice mindfulness, that part of that ventromedial prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain starts to develop, and we associate a certain beingness with that state of acceptance. So the part of ourselves gets more and more connected to a state of calm, peace, and acceptance. So we're expanding our sense of self to include that. That's what mindfulness can do for us, in a manner of speaking. Whereas if you do more intense practices, so not just contemplating, but doing a practice such as deeper breathing, repetitive movements and sounds, which is certainly what the zikr ritual is, then you're able to begin to break down the neurological circuits of old beliefs. So we're engaging neuroplasticity now because there's more activity going on. Sitting in a mindful state is certainly different to the breathing and the movement involved, where there's a lot more glucose and oxygen moving around in the brain when you're doing this kind of ritual. And that can help us to transform the way we think and behave. So there was a question earlier about neuroplasticity and, does it take a long time if a habit is really entrenched? Well, actually, the theory is that you could reach a state of enlightenment if there is a very radical and fast rearrangement of neuronal connections in quite a short time. So how this rearrangement occurs is still not completely defined, but it's essentially, instead of a neuroplastic change taking place over time, where we are practicing a new habit and doing over and over and over, and then choosing that pathway instead of the old one, there is such an infusion of building blocks in the brain, oxygen, glucose, calcium is also involved, that part of the brain rearranges itself. So this is to do with the axonal dendritic connections and the synapses. They rearrange themselves enough for there to be a new pathway that we take as a matter of default. Now, I don't know if anyone here has had these kind of aha moments in life where you go, oh, now I suddenly grasp something. That happens because there is this quite sudden neuroplastic change. If that happens in one of these spiritual networks in the brain, and it's profound and big enough, which you would kind of need to be in one of these intense practices to be doing if you want it fast, otherwise you're looking at 20 to 30 years of meditation, then you could stay in a more permanent state of enlightenment. Because what tends to happen when we have those temporary states of enlightenment is after a few hours, days, weeks, if we're lucky, they go again, and we return to our normal pathways. So I see lots of aha moments going on here in the chat box. I'm going to continue moving on. So you're welcome to ask your questions and I'll mark them for answering later on. So what is my definition of enlightenment? We're going to get to that. So you're preempted where we're going now. So how to reach enlightenment? A state of I guess, seeing the truth behind things, as opposed to our interpretation of them, but maybe seeing through to the true nature of what is. So there is a way through this kind of experiments that a pathway has been drawn to reach enlightenment. So we're going to do let's see if we have time. We might not have time to do a practice of this today because we're a little bit pushed for time, but I'll talk you through it and you will receive all of this later on. So you can do this for yourself afterwards and see whether you get enlightened. Please let me know if you do. So first of all, we need to talk about the levels of awareness. So again, this is Andrew Newberg, the information that I'm sharing with you here. He says there are 6 levels of awareness. The first one is instinctual awareness. These correlate to areas in the brain. Instinctual awareness is a little bit like a worm. So there is perhaps a bit of sensory processing going on. We know whether it's hot or cold. We know whether we're liking something or whether it's bad. And we're very based on survival. And you can see on the screen the kind of brain areas involved: thalamus, amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, a few other areas. The second level of awareness is what's called habitual responsiveness. So just to give you an example, during a normal day, you would have instinctual awareness, which is level 1, when you wake up in the morning, because there's cortisol levels rising, and that makes you wake up unless it's your alarm clock. So that's what instinctively gets you to wake up. There's no choice that you're making about that. The second level, habitual responsiveness, is what you do when you wake up. Now, unfortunately, many of us these days when we wake up is we reach out for our phone. See what's the time, how do I snooze this thing, what's been happening in the world if you're into social media, etc. So in habitual responsiveness, it's to do with learning, memory, formation and recall, what was happening yesterday, who am I, what's my name again, where am I? And it's also where we have some unconscious behavior, these things that we might not have fully planned, but we're carrying out as a matter of habit. So that's where the habitual responsiveness comes from. Then step 3 is intentional decision making. So this is about, what do I actually want to do? So I might wander down to the kitchen and say, what do I want for breakfast? And start opening up some cupboards and see what's there. And so here we're able to process languages, feelings, and we can set ourselves some conscious goals as well. So I want to eat, I'm going to give myself some choices, and my temporal and parietal area will be involved in that because I'm now using words and language and my senses. So I'm beyond habit, I'm thinking now, I'm in more of a beta brainwave state. And then beyond that, the next level is creative imagination. So this would be if, for example, there's nothing in the kitchen that I want as it is, but I would then have to start getting a bit creative about where my breakfast is going to come from. So this can be quite productive, or it can be more of a daydream. Oh, I wish there was in front of me such and such. And we start to associate more freely and our mind wanders. So that involves what's called the resting state network and interhemispheric activity. It's also where our memories are reconsolidated. If we don't go into that state every once in a while, it becomes impossible to remember everything because we're not associating anything with anything. I hope you're getting the sense of this now. These things work through association if we want to remember them. And then number 5 is probably the edge of where most of us get to in our normal lives if we really make an effort. And that's to do with intuitive, symbolic, non-judgmental processing of self and others. So at this point, we are doing mindfulness. We're allowing deeper things to arise from inside us. The insula is there, the interior cingulate. There's enhanced connectivity between the frontal and parietal activity. Interestingly, when Einstein died and they dissected his brain, they saw that he had an unusual amount of connection in exactly those areas. So there was a way in which he was processing that either he had that when he was born or he really built that through his life, this kind of self-reflective awareness that was more intuitive. So that's where we then might get to when we go, I made this thing for breakfast, or I had this thing. How do I want to improve my life now? What might I do tomorrow? What's guiding me? What might be the ways in which I could change something? Or, what does this symbolize that I had this instead of this other thing? So journaling and things like that are really good for self-reflective awareness, along with doing therapy work, etc. And then finally, the 6th stage. So transformational awareness. Those are life-changing insights that are providing deeper meaning and purpose. So this is those aha moments. Something falls into place and there are ensuing changes in our brain, in the thalamus, the cortex, the midbrain, and the amygdala. So there we are changed because of our reflection. So we won't do this together today because I have spent a little bit of extra time explaining a few things to you, but I invite you to do this later in your own time. It's what's called automatic writing, and you can take a picture of the screen, or you'll receive all of this recording later, so you can do this in your own time. It's essentially a way in which you write from different levels of awareness in your being. And there's been research that shows that this is really good if you're processing grief, to move between those levels of awareness. And it can also help to interrupt negative thinking. It can help with depressive symptoms, again, because it's changing your point of view on something, looking at it from different angles. And if you're really good at this, for example, there are a specific type of psychic medium who do psychography, and essentially they're writing messages from spirit. And when they're doing that, and they're really experienced, and you look at their brain, you would expect for their temporal lobe to be very busy, because that's where language is based and memory. But actually, those parts of the brain become less active, which is so interesting. So they're doing that without accessing language or memory directly, which is a good indication that something else is going on. So here is what you can take yourselves through. It's literally as it says it here on the screen. All the instructions are here, step by step. So you can either get someone to read it out for you or just go through it yourself step by step as you practice this later on. So I hope you'll forgive that we don't do that now, but instead we continue to the next bit. And I'm also going to skip this brain break here because we have 32 minutes and I really want to get to a few other things that we need to look at. So if you need to rest your brain and you're finding yourself getting a bit overwhelmed by information, do move around, drink something, do something to change your environment a little bit. And again, you can always listen into this again later if you find yourself a little bit overburdened by this. So we're going to move on now to transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is another neuroscience method. So remember, fMRI was showing us where something is happening in the brain, the locality. TMS tells us about causality. What is it that is improving or interrupting a function? So how do we really know what any part of the brain does? It's a problem because it might be, for example, as you can see on the diagram on the left, that our eye is seeing something, but it's actually not the eye itself that is creating the image we see in our mind. There are processes happening between the information, the light information coming in through the eye that goes back to the visual cortex. And that is what is creating what we are experiencing as sight. And if you were to disturb the visual cortex or somehow damage it, you might say, oh, but it must be the visual cortex that does sight. Well, actually, no. There is a network between the eye and the visual cortex that is involved in that, which even includes the amygdala, which you might remember as this smoke detector part of the brain that's always scanning to see if there's something that needs to be paid attention to because it's dangerous. So it's easy to confuse functions between a specific area and the connections between them. And that's called topological approach when it's the place, from Greek topos, which means a place, and the hodological approach, which is Greek for a pathway. So it's very interesting with people who have what's called blind sight. They might have damage to the pathway between the eye and the visual cortex at the back of the brain, but they can see without realizing that they can see. So they can still navigate down a narrow corridor with loads of obstacles because there is basic visual information going via the amygdala and then reaching the visual cortex. So what TMS tries to do is it tries to establish what is involved in something. Remember, with MRI, that's a problem because you don't know whether an area is just resting or whether it's to do with simply seeing or thinking. But here with TMS, you're trying to either excite an area or make an area less active to see what then happens to that function. And so if a function completely disappears because you are repressing the amygdala, you'll go, well, I guess the amygdala had some kind of role in it. It might not be the full picture, but it gives me information that is a little bit more valid in terms of cause than what an fMRI can do. So TMS is usually measured with EEG, and I'm going to take you through just a few examples of why it's interesting, this brain disruption thing in terms of spirituality. So What has been seen is that when different types of disruption happen in the brain, there is a stronger correlation with self-transcendence. So what does that mean? Well, for example, if somebody is suffering from cerebral hypoxia, which means there's a lack of oxygen because they're choking or because they're hyperventilating or engaging in prolonged and very deep pranayama, then the lack of oxygen in the brain creates a kind of dysfunction, and that's often linked to having spiritual experiences. The same with physiological stress. Now, this doesn't mean that you have a deadline and your boss is on your case. This means that your body is fighting for survival. Because, for example, the body is really unwell, you're having a near-death experience, or there's a septicemia all over the body or something. Anita Moorjani, who had a near-death experience and wrote a book called Dying to Be Me, suffered extreme physiological stress and had an extremely spiritual experience during that. So you're starting to see the pattern here. People who engage in ritual, for example, the zikr that we saw, or hypnosis or mediumship, they have trance-induced physiological effects that can also give a sense of connection with spirit or oneness or closeness to God, whatever your spiritual direction is. The same with psychedelics. The action of a lot of those, they don't actually increase activity in the brain. Psychedelics reduce activity in the brain. So it's perhaps through some kind of reduction of some sort of function that spirituality is experienced by us. The same with physical trauma. So if somebody has a stroke, bullet wounds, or they have surgery because of brain cancer or whatnot, sometimes they have an awakened sense of spirituality, which is pretty extraordinary. What a gift in return for having that kind of trauma to the brain. And then TMS, which is probably the least dangerous out of these. It doesn't involve any lasting damage or any strange activities that you have to do to yourself, such as choking. So we're going to look at a study to do with TMS now. If you're interested in this, the reference is on the screen by Bernardo Kastrup, who wrote an article about self-transcendence correlating with brain function impairment. So we're going to go through this study with TMS, written by an Italian research team, Crescentini and colleagues. And they were looking at how you could excite the inferior parietal cortex and thereby get people to have a less strong experience of religiousness or spirituality. So just make sure you're still paying attention. What function is associated with the parietal lobe? Is it memory or proprioception? Okay, we've got a few people here who are on the case. So the parietal lobe is indeed associated with proprioception. It's the contortionist lady, remember, around the parietal lobe. And what type of emotions is the right hemisphere associated with processing, positive or negative? You're really paying attention. It's negative emotions that are predominantly processed on the right side. Very good. So if we just look at the title of this study, we already know what sort of thing they're trying to do. They are trying to, using TMS, which we'll look at how you do in a minute, they're trying to excite proprioception, which is our sense of where we are in space, and they're trying to excite negative emotion. I'm going to, in the interest of time, go through the TMS procedure a little bit quickly, but you can look back over this in your own time. So essentially, TMS is a way in which there is a magnetic field that is created when an electrical current moves through this kind of wand that you hold over the brain in specific places. And the speed of those electrical bursts in there create a magnetic field in the brain that has a certain form. So those magnetic pulses, you could say, are stimulating the electrical currents in the brain between the synapses. Remember, the synapses have electrical current. So if you're interfering with those, then you can get different effects in the brain. So there are two ways. You can either try to increase the activity in the brain or repress the activity in the brain. And in this study, they did something called theta burst stimulation, which means that they were doing it 5 times a second. It was 5 hertz, which is the theta rhythm in EEG, which we spoke about earlier. So this rhythm they were using was 5 times a second. Right. Where were they doing it? On the right inferior parietal lobe, in particular on the angular gyrus, which sits here at the back. So they did 3 things to these poor participants in this study. On some of them, they did continuous stimulation for 20 seconds at a time, like zzz, on that area, and that has an inhibitory effect. So it really decreases the activity in that area for up to 30 minutes at a time. And they found previously that increased people's sense of religiousness and spirituality. They became more self-transcendent. That was a previous study that they did. And in this one, they did also intermittent stimulation, and that's, you sort of go zzz, 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 like that, and that excites that area. So it's like you're making the oscillations more intense. And that has shown to give people less of a spiritual or religious experience in themselves. And then they also did a fake one where essentially they just held the thing over people's heads to see if there was going to be any reaction from them. And in order to test how religious and spiritual they were feeling, of course, that's how do you do that? You could ask people, but in neuroscience, that's not quite good enough because then they could be lying to you. So they made a test where people were essentially having to do implicit association. So they showed them different words on the screen, like there are here: soul, believer, divine, eternal, carnal, cynical, logical, physical. And people were asked to say whether it's a religious or spiritual term or whether it's not religious or spiritual. So for example, here, soul would be religious and spiritual, and logical would not be. And they were asked to do the same with words to do with oneself and others. So for example, I is to do with self, and hers or you is to do with other, right? And then they had a button where they had non-religious and self on the same button, and another button where they had religious and spiritual and other on it. So you had to press the button on the left if the term you saw was not to do with religion or spirituality, or it was to do with the self, and the other one if it was religious or spiritual or to do with other people. So then they showed them those words and they tried to categorize them as fast as possible. Now, a congruous condition, as it's called, is when they had religious and spiritual and self on the same button. And incongruous is what you're seeing here on the screen when they had non-religious, spiritual, or self on the same button. So we'll get into that in just a second. So here we are. So what did the results show in this study? Well, they were able to increase the activity of that part of the brain, which made people feel less religious and spiritual because they were faster to click the button that had self and non-religious spiritual terms on it when they had turned that part of the parietal cortex off using the TMS procedure. So essentially, it was easier for participants to associate themselves with not being religious or spiritual. They could press the button faster that they were on along with not spiritual. Whereas a previous study had showed that you could make people with another type of stimulation essentially press the self religious spiritual button faster when they depressed that area and made it inactive. They weren't able to replicate that in this study, so they couldn't make people more religious using this particular protocol of theta burst 5 times a second. But a previous study that they did, which was 10 hertz with a kind of 2 pulse, they were able to make people press the button that had self and spirituality on it faster than when it was the other way around. So the study had strengths and limitations. It was a very small amount of people. There were only 14 participants, which is tiny, tiny for a study that is to do with neuroscience. And they were also very young. These were 22-year-olds plus or minus a couple of years. And they were Catholic. So the question is really, that part of the brain, is it really to do with Catholicism and the structures involved with that? Or is it something else that's going on in that part of the brain? Because of course, in some approaches to spirituality, carnal and things like that wouldn't really mean anything. Whereas in Catholicism, that has a particular meaning. So what's interesting about this is it's been done on a small population of Italian men who are all of a certain age who were Catholic. To what extent can we generalize that to the population of people who might be more spiritual in a more free-form way of different ages? So actually, previous studies showed, as it says here on the screen, that if you decrease the activity in that area, it's actually linked to feeling more selfless and more forgiveness. And the words they used in this study were not related to that. So what we can conclude from this study is that that form of transcranial magnetic stimulation can indeed decrease your implicit feeling of self-transcendence. So you can sort of lose your Catholic religion a little bit because they became slower at that when they did this. And there is another form of TMS that can increase that if you use the right pulse in the same place. So you could say that that area of the brain is probably linked to something to do with religion and spirituality, but it's not quite clear if it's the correct dimension that was measured here. And actually, this study here was from 2015. And in the years since then, there's now been many more studies that show that selflessness, also known as altruism, which means taking the other into account before ourselves, or maybe alongside ourselves, is identified as a universal neuropsychological foundation of spiritual transcendence. So if you find the place of selflessness in the brain, which is in that right inferior parietal lobule close to the angular gyrus, that is where there is usually some kind of modulation when there is an experience of spiritual transcendence going on. So we're going to do this together now. So what I would like you to do is choose whether you want to excite your parietal lobe or inhibit your parietal lobe, okay? So you just decide that amongst yourselves. And those of you who want to excite your parietal lobe, what I want you to do is bring your awareness really to your physical sensation. So really feel your body. Feel the fact that you're sitting on the chair, and you might place your hand on your parietal lobe. So you find the midpoint halfway back. You place your hand here a little bit towards the back of your head. So you really feel yourself in your physical body, okay? When you do that, you're exciting your parietal lobe because you're making it active and opening it for input, okay? So maybe half of you can do that, and others inhibit your parietal lobe. That's not so easy without a TMS, but try and do it by expanding your awareness beyond yourself. So feel how the edges of you could become blurry. Maybe if you're sitting on something, it's somehow like you're sinking a little bit into that, and where you end and the chair begins isn't quite clear. Feel yourself expanding out to become one with the universe. Just don't pass out while you're doing this, okay? So you are expanding beyond yourself. Your edges do not count. You are at one with the greater field around you, okay? And you can do this later if you want to play this back the other way around, so you can try what it's like. So just keep that in mind, exciting or inhibiting your parietal lobe. You're going to see on the screen now altruistic and non-altruistic words, and I want you to categorize them either into altruistic or not altruistic. So you might just, with one hand, kind of point towards the screen and imagine you were clicking the button for the word that comes up, okay? So we'll do the first one together. So what comes up is hate. So you would click not altruistic. Hate is definitely not an altruistic thing, okay? So you could click that quite quickly because you categorized it. Here comes the next one, forgiving. Okay, that's an altruistic term. Did you all get that? Just click as fast as you can in your imaginary keyboard here while you're holding that state of consciousness. Sharing, altruistic. Revenge, not altruistic. Selfless, altruistic, right? We're going fast, hope you're following along. Now, we're going to do the self and other words. So here we go. They're going to appear on the screen, words to do with myself or others. And again, you'll categorize them. So here we go. Me. So you would click self. And then us. Again, that's self because me is part of us. Yours, that's other. Them, that's other. All right, good. That was very short because it's pretty obvious. So now we're going to do one where the button is incongruent. It means you're going to have a button that has self and not altruistic on it, and the other button is going to have other and altruistic on it, okay? Here we go. So those are the two buttons, self, not altruistic, and other, altruistic on there. Ready? Here comes the first word. Forgiving. Now, how fast were you able to click altruistic on the right-hand side? Did you hesitate? Next, revenge. You have to click the button that says self and not altruistic. Hate. Again, self, not altruistic. Sharing, other and altruistic. Okay. So now we're going to do the congruent condition. So keep holding now those states of being that you are in, either really aware of your body or really identified with something much larger than yourself, blurry edges, you're all the way out there expanded in the field. Okay, so now the buttons you're going to see have got altruistic and self on one and not altruistic and other on the other one. Okay, here we go. Revenge, not altruistic and other. Forgiving, altruistic and self. Hate, not altruistic and other. Sharing, altruistic and self. Okay, so we don't have time to go through all of your kind of feedback if you have things to say about that now, but You might just notice in yourself if the incongruent condition where the button had self and not altruistic was faster or slower for you to imagine pushing than the altruistic and self one. I know for myself that when I do that exercise, it takes me quite a lot longer to categorize the words when self and not altruistic are on the same button. It takes me perhaps twice as long than if self and altruistic are on the same button. So what TMS would do is essentially identify you more with a larger field because it's repressing your representation of yourself. Your proprioception goes really down, and you are therefore not so in yourself, but much more ready to be identified with a larger field. So this is how TMS, and I don't know for those of you who did the inhibition of your parietal lobe just now, if you had a sense that it was easy for you to press the button that had self and not altruistic. I don't know if any of you can write a few things there. Yeah, so it's a way that we get a little bit less identified with ourselves and we're more in the universal field. Some of you are quite enthusiastic about that. So it's a fun one. When you review this at some point, do the other one, hold the other state that you were in. So, either repress or encourage the other one and see if it's different for you. So just take a moment now to rebalance yourselves physically and spiritually so that you can take in, we're on the home run now of this presentation. We're coming to the very last neuroscience method after we've done fMRI that shows us where things are happening, and now TMS that shows us more the cause. What is an area doing, and does a function still work if that area is offline? So I hope you're getting a sense of these are very different approaches to doing neuroscience investigations. So now we come last and perhaps least to my own study. I have been doing EEG studies at the University of Kent. And EEG allows us to put electrodes on the head, like I explained at the very beginning, to measure brainwaves. And there's me in the lab with a whole load of electrodes on me. And I know that quite a few of you who are here listening to this today were part of that study. So thank you again for coming and contributing your brainwaves to this study. So what EEG allows us to do is temporality. It tells us when is something happening. It tells us a little bit about where, but it's nowhere near as precise as fMRI. You can see on my head there where those electrodes are placed. They cover quite wide areas, but at least it gives us some information about the lobe of the brain in which it's happening. So I have a few there on my frontal lobe, and I have a lot more towards the side on the temporal lobe and some at the back as well. So the way that EEG works, just as a very quick recap, synapses between neurons, hopefully familiar words for you now, generate tiny electrical currents. A sensitive electrode placed on the scalp can record these. If there is a big change in current, the wave that is drawn on the EEG has bigger amplitude, and that's shown down here below. Amplitude is from top to bottom. You remember the Zen master we were talking about, he had bimodal brainwave coherency. He had specific amplitudes. He had big waves and small waves that were repeating again and again. So the amplitude was within two very specific ranges. And then the speed of the waves, that's the frequency. That is telling you how many waves are happening within a second, okay? And that's what tells us whether it's a beta, alpha, or theta wave. So that's what EEG gives us information about. So what I tried to do in my EEG hypnosis study, the title kind of gives it away, was to do EEG measurements on people that I put into a hypnotized state, which is essentially a kind of trance that is a state of altered consciousness. So the definition is here on screen for you. It resembles sleep, but it is not. And the person is induced into hypnosis by another. So it's not something you do for yourself. I mean, you can do self-hypnosis. There are some results on that, but hypnosis by another can give stronger results. So a person is giving you suggestions and you essentially accept those suggestions, and then it takes you on into this trance-like state. It's different to meditation. What's similar is that it is a different state of consciousness where there is more attention, there's more concentration, and you are letting go of thoughts, you're letting come. But what's different between hypnosis and meditation is that in hypnosis, you're actively seeking what your sensory input is. You're being curious about what you're sensing. Whereas in meditation, particularly mindfulness forms, it's about letting come and letting go. In hypnosis, there's also more of an active processing because there's a voice coming at you that you're doing something with. There's perhaps more memory and trying to remember instructions. And there's a disturbance in the sense of time. So some people that meditate do have that as well, but in hypnosis, which I often do with people for hours at a time, there can be a real temporal distortion going on. So the underlying kind of necessity for good meditation is mindfulness, and what you need for good hypnosis is suggestibility. So we'll look a little bit more at that in a second. So I was doing a particular kind of hypnosis called LBL, Life Between Lives Regression Hypnotherapy, which is defined by the man who came up with it, Michael Newton, as a deep hypnotic process developed over many years, which is designed to connect you with your soul self, your guiding beings, and thereby awaken an understanding of your immortal identity. And here comes the answer to this question about, well, what is enlightenment? I mean, I don't have one answer to that, but according to this sort of research, enlightenment, an experience of that would be when the true nature of something is evoked. That means seeing through the physical realm and all our own associations and connections and rules and habits around that, and seeing through to the true nature, which is what the Buddha would say. So this kind of piercing through to oneness. And that might involve some hemi-coherence, as we saw earlier with the Zen master, and perhaps even a halo formation. So a quick run through of the findings that have been shown previously for hypnosis in EEG studies. It's been studied very widely, general hypnosis. So if you engage in ritual trance, which is kind of repetitive movements, a little bit like the zikr we saw earlier for the Sufis, that can create more theta and gamma frequencies. So increased power means that there's more of those in relation to the other frequencies at the same time. So I've tried to show on the screen here what different traces look like on an EEG. In the top left, it's a delta wave. So you can see there's one big wave and then a little bit of a blur. So there's about 1 or 2 oscillations per second. And the blue wave here is theta wave. That's also showing 1 second worth of recording. And you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's about 6 peaks there in total. So that falls within the theta band. That's often associated with the superconscious, as I mentioned before. And so this study found, not my one, but this one here that I'm referring to, found that there was more theta and more gamma frequency in a hypnotic state. So gamma is the orange one down here in the middle at the bottom. You can see how much more busy that is. And then there's other studies that show that when you're hypnotized, that only decreases delta and it increases beta frequency versus non-hypnosis. So that's quite different bands that they saw a result in. Yet other studies show that there is a greater activity in a sub-band of theta called theta 2. So that's a very specific frequency within the theta band. And then another study showed that there is more alpha power in the posterior parts of the brain in people who are susceptible to hypnosis. So you can see a real mixed bag of findings. Some of it is consistent and some of it is quite disparate. So I decided to get people in for a 1-hour study because that's the amount of time, you remember earlier, that it takes to get that drop in the cortex when people are engaging in meditation. And it was also a suitable amount of time to have people in the lab. So I recorded a 1-hour hypnosis using the LBL technique. And I recruited participants who all scored quite highly on what's called hypnotic susceptibility. That means that they're able to receive suggestions. And I measured that by this scale that shows you how absorbed someone can become in something. And as an example, I'm able to wander off into my thoughts while doing a routine task and actually forget that I'm doing the task, and then find a few minutes later that I've completed it. Somebody who has that quite often and strongly in their life is probably quite hypnotically susceptible because they have a high absorption trait. So everybody who was recruited had high scores on that. So here it shows you I got 34 participants in total who turned up from social media because I put the campaign out there. And they all scored 60 or more on this absorption scale, and the mean score was 79, which is quite high. So I knew they could all be hypnotized. Otherwise, there was no point in bringing them to the lab. And then there's a bit of information here for those of you who like scientific studies about how I set it up and what specifically I was looking at. So I'll just talk you through that. I put electrodes on their head in the frontal lobe, which you now all know where is and what it does, in the coronal area, which was right down that central sulcus between the frontal and parietal lobe. I had some in the temporal locations, green here on the screen, to check what was happening with their verbal understanding, their memory writing, and then in the parietal lobe to check on their sense of self, their proprioception in space. So they sat in the lab for 1 hour in a dark room listening to this hypnosis script with all these EEG electrodes on their head. And there was 20 minutes of each part of the hypnosis. The first 20 minutes were an induction, where essentially I was talking them through a body relaxation. So you might have listened to that before with all kinds of relaxation recordings. Yoga Nidra is very similar to that. Then there was 20 minutes of deepening, where I was starting to get them to visualize certain things that were certainly not in the boring lab, but a beautiful meadow and nature and such like. And then in the last 20 minutes, I brought them into a white room where we kind of orchestrated for there to be an object that they were interacting with and a spiritual encounter with a benign presence. And what I found over that hour, so each of these bars you see now on the screen represents 20 minutes, the induction and relaxation, the deepening meadow visualization, and the experiencing white room, was that there was more and more alpha wave power in the parietal lobe. And what that tells us is that the brain waves in their parietal lobe, which is their sense of self, were slowing down, indicating that they were becoming dissociated from their bodies. And that got stronger and stronger, as you can see, over the hour. So they were further and further away from their normal sense of self. And then I also looked, so that was in the parietal lobe, and then I looked at theta power in the frontal lobe. What I was expecting was that the theta power would go up and up, because that's what's been shown for spiritual experiences, that the frontal lobe slows down. Remember, we saw on those fMRI brain scans of the Zika ritual, they became less active there. So you would expect to see slower brainwave patterns over time. But I found there was slower ones to begin with, and then suddenly they dropped and they actually sped up towards the end. So I've got a whole sub-analysis here of a sub-study that I then did to try and find out what was happening. So what I ended up doing, instead of allowing that last 20 minutes to be a phase on its own, was that I subdivided it into 4 sections, because, as I mentioned a moment ago, there was a lot of things going on in that white room. They were getting to the white room, entering it. They were focusing on a special object that they discovered there. Then I was getting them to focus on some kind of presence in the room, and then they were discovering that that presence was actually themselves. So there were 4 specific phases that they went through. So I didn't get the the increase in theta wave activity that I was expecting, but I thought, well, if I sub-analyze it differently, maybe there'll be a little bit more information here for me. So when I then carried out that analysis, I decided to look specifically at sub-bands inside this theta wave frequency band. So you'll remember before that theta wave is approximately 3 or 4 to 7 or 8 hertz, right? So I looked specifically at what is the theta 2 subband. So that's just oscillations that are between 5.5 and 7.5 times a second, because studies have shown that there's more activity in that subband in hypnosis. Whereas in meditation, there's more activity in the theta 1 subband, the slower ones closer to the delta state. So that kind of makes sense, because hypnosis is a little bit more of an active state. You're processing more information. So I decided to analyze that subband specifically, theta 2. And I also decided to look in a more narrow gamma band. So you might remember earlier on when I was introducing the different bands to you, there is a specific narrow band between 38 and 42 hertz that's correlated with sensory and cognitive association in the brain. It's how the senses are communicating between themselves and trying to make sense of the senses, if you like. So I thought, well, I'll look at that specifically because there's lots of suggestions being given to them here about what they're visually exploring and recognizing. And when I then did that, lo and behold, I found some much more telling results. So what you're seeing on the screen in blue is the theta band, and what you're seeing in orange is the gamma band. And those of you who are still able to process information at this point, we're coming now to 2.5 hours, is that they are inverse of one another. So as it drops in theta and then rises towards the end, it rises in gamma and drops towards the end. And this is a pattern that you often see in the brain, that there's a mirror imaging of theta and gamma, which of course makes sense to a certain extent, because if a part of the brain is going really slowly, it's not going to be going really fast, which is gamma, at the same time. So you would expect, if it starts to speed up, that it would also drop in speed in the same area, right? That kind of makes logical sense. So what I saw was a significant increase in theta between the last two sections of that third place where they were in the white room. And that's the difference between when they were feeling the spiritual presence and then associating that meaning to themselves. And the significant drop happened in gamma at the same time, between exploring the presence and then understanding it's themselves. So I'll just quickly go through this, so we'll bring the presentation to an end. Essentially, I'm making sense of this drop in gamma wave between understanding that there is a presence and the drop in the presence meaning to self, because participants were invited to focus on the intensity, the feelings, the colors that was in the room. So that's what's happening in the presence. I'm specifically asking them to get very aware of the sensory experience that they're in. So of course, they're going to start putting more of their sensory information together, because that's what I'm inviting them to do. And remember, all of the participants scored highly enough on the suggestibility scale that they were obedient enough to do that. And then when it became about the presence meaning to self, there was a drastic drop in gamma. So now they're no longer receiving sensory information from inside themselves. They're instead doing something different. So then we move on to the theta wave one here, where we can see the opposite that happened. So here, what I was specifically asking them to do here was to apply this higher self as having all of the highest and most perfect attributes that they show when they are also complete. So here we're dropping them into a much deeper meaning, quite an emotional experience for a lot of the participants, which then shows this increase in their theta 2 power. So this is no longer to do with sensory processing, but something else that's going on. Now, I wrote about my analysis of this quite extensively in a paper that's about to come out in a journal from the Newton Institute. It's much too much to explain here in terms of the details of what all of this could mean. But I invite you to either look that up on the Newton Institute when they publish that in the next few weeks, or if you're interested, you're really welcome to email me and I can send you two exciting things. I can both send you a recording of that script if you would like to listen to it. It's an hour long and it takes you through these different stages. So you can also experience those changes in your brainwave states that these many 30+ participants did. And I can send you a reader-friendly write-up that explains the results with many more findings that I can't cover here today. So that takes us to the end of our EEG explanation. I'm sorry for rushing more towards the end now, but I hope you get a sense of how different these neuroscience approaches are, but how they can all shed light in different ways on what we perceive to be spiritual experiences, to try to discern more information about how the brain, how the mind is providing a platform for those in our human existence. And I want to thank you very much for your attention and participation today. There are a few questions that are unanswered, which I will go back through. I want to tell you also that there is more of this information out there. There is more of these seminars coming up. The next one I'm doing is about neuroscience and body-mind, where we're going to be exploring how the body contributes to our thoughts and feelings, linking on from today. And what our gut feeling is, how some people can sense what others can feel very empathically and others find that difficult, and how we can improve our brain function. We learned about neuroplasticity today, how we can help improve that through various types of physical activity, and how can we hope to keep our brain in good shape through the lifespan. So that's coming up in the next seminar, which is at the end of June, specifically on the 29th. And getting back to the theme of today, I'm going to leave here a few resources on the screen for you. These show you some summaries of brain structures if you want to read more about that, brain waves by frequency, and a book I really recommend where lots of the information today on the fMRIs was sourced from, which is Dr. Andrew Newberg's and Peter Robert Waldman's How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, a great book from 2016. Really recommended to read how they collated information using fMRI. Now you know that there are also other approaches, including TMS and EEG. Hopefully you have an understanding of those. And just to let you know, I know it's early, but in 1 year's time, there is going to be a conference that I am co-hosting with Sheila French, who is a spiritual medium and runs a school for training spiritual mediumship. We are presenting the Science and Spirit Frontiers Conference, first of its kind in Maidstone in Kent, where we're getting together lots of different presenters and demonstrators from different spiritual approaches, schools of spiritual contact and evolution, and we're going to try and provide a scientific, neuroscientific and psychological commentary on those with experientials and demonstrations. So hopefully we'll be able to do some live EEG on the stage when somebody is in a state of spiritual mediumship, and lots of breakout rooms where you can also experience things in smaller and bigger groups for yourself. So we're very excited about that. Hope to get your support, your presence. You can come for one day or both days. The website is up. You can't get your tickets just yet, but the tickets will be available in a couple of weeks' time once the hotel is able to take your reservations. But we're letting everybody know in good time. It's limited to 200 participants. That's all the venue can cater for. So we thought, well, first come, first serve, and then we can see whether we do another one in England later on. There's already talk of 2020 in Switzerland in a 400-person venue as well as a follow-on from that conference. So thank you very much for your participation and your attention. We've gone a few minutes over time today. I'm going to stick around here for a little while longer to answer your questions and any comments you might have, but that's kind of the formal part over. If you need to go and just stretch your body, have a drink, and pat yourself on your parietal part of your cortex now for some very good participation. Thank you. Thank you very much for the feedback. So while you're typing, I'm just going to start going back to the questions that were asked earlier on. So there was one around this was when we were talking about the fMRI studies that happen in this huge machine. And there's a question about how can you disable the locus coeruleus due to lying down in fMRI. So the locus coeruleus is a part of, it's located in the brainstem and has projections to all different parts of the brain. And it really modulates attention. So it helps us pay attention to something or kind of wander off and not really be there. It's very difficult to disable that because it's an automatic process that happens in the brain. And this is, again, underlines why fMRI is so difficult to undertake, because how can you know that two subjects that you put in the fMRI are doing the same thing with their brain at the same time? One person might be incredibly attentive to everything that's going on while another person is just relaxing and chilling out. Although that's quite difficult in an fMRI, it's quite loud what goes on in there. So I don't know of any ways to disable the locus coeruleus unless you try to interrupt the pathways that it uses. Off the top of my head, that's noradrenaline. Giving somebody a noradrenaline suppressant might create other wanted effects in the brain. So I don't know if that gives much to your question, but just a few thoughts on that. So somebody's asking if the next seminar includes all the basic brain information. No, it doesn't. Then every seminar would have to be kind of longer and longer as we go along. So I'm hoping that people who want to come to the next one might just download the recording of this one ahead of time and make themselves kind of familiar with that. We go over a few things very basically, but as you can see, to get that kind of foundation takes a while. So I'm hoping that each seminar builds on top of each other. So what have we got here? Locus coeruleus, it switches off when we lie down, suspends noradrenaline so we don't act on our dreams. Okay, so that must be the locus coeruleus in the dream state. I don't know, I didn't know that it switched off automatically when we lie down. So I'll do a bit more reading about that. Thank you for the pointer. And then there is one more question about gamma. Is gamma often a harmonic, though 40 hertz happen at the same time as 7.8? Yes. So this was when we were talking about the EEG study at the end. So the question here is about Is it possible to have this 40 hertz frequency where there is sensory integration going on at the same time of theta? Yes, it is. As you saw, if I go back to those screens again, you can see that gamma hasn't disappeared when theta is active, and theta hasn't disappeared when gamma is active. But it's more like the brain cannot sustain having very high levels of both. There is usually always in studies a kind of mirroring that happens between them, but that's different to an either or type of suppression setup. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. All right, good. I'm glad it makes sense. So I am going to go now and have a little bit of a cold drink. And I look forward to seeing those of you who are coming again next time. Thank you for your participation. Over the next few days, I will get this whole download together for you and send you the resources and downloads so that you can do the bits we had to go through a little bit quickly again. Try to do that automatic writing exercise if you're interested in it. Really interesting to see how you are when you modulate those states of being in yourself. Thank you. Good to see all of you.